Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. Sign the paper, Julian, or get out of my house. The ultimatum hung in the frigid air of the obsidian-walled study, sharper than the cut of the three-piece suit wearing the man behind the desk. Julian Vane felt the familiar, suffocating pressure of an alpha's command wash over him, a heavy, static weight that sought to force his knees to the floor. But Julian was not the trembling university student he had been 7 years ago. He was an Omega, yes, but he had spent the better part of a decade building steel spines into skyscrapers. He dug his nails into his palms, the sharp pain grounding him, and met the gaze of the man he hated more than anyone on earth. "It's not your house yet, Cashin," Julian spat, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "Technically, until the probate period ends, half of this mausoleum belongs to me." Cashin Draxos, the CEO of Draxos Heavy Industries and the man whose face graced the cover of every financial magazine in the country, leaned back in his leather chair. The movement was predatory, like a panther adjusting its weight before a pounce. His eyes, the color of storm-tossed iron, tracked Julian's every micro-expression. "Read the fine print, darling," Cashin said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Julian's chest. Clause 14b. You inherit the Vane family fortune, the billions, the estate, the legacy, only if you reside in the primary residence for 6 consecutive months. And the primary residence, Cashin gestured vaguely to the opulent, shadowed room around them, is currently under my stewardship as the executor. You live with me, by my rules, or you forfeit everything to charity. Your grandfather was a twisted old man, but he was thorough. Julian looked at the document on the mahogany desk. It was a lifeline. His architectural firm was drowning in debt after a sabotaged contract. His employees were weeks away from being laid off. This inheritance was the only way to save the people who depended on him. But the cost was living with Cashin. The man who had seduced him, claimed his first heat, and then abandoned him the morning after graduation to marry a corporate merger disguised as a woman. "Why?" Julian whispered, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Why didn't you just contest the will? You have more money than God. You don't need this headache." Cashin stood up. He was massive, towering over 6 feet, radiating a scent of burnt cedar and ozone, a scent that used to be Julian's favorite smell in the world. Now, it just smelled like betrayal. He walked around the desk, stopping inches from Julian. "Because," Cashin murmured, leaning down until his breath ghosted over the sensitive gland on Julian's neck, causing a traitorous shiver to race down the Omega's spine. "Watching you squirm has always been my favorite pastime. The first week at Blackwood Manor was a lesson in psychological warfare. The estate was vast, a sprawling Gothic revival monstrosity, perched on the cliffs overlooking the churning sea. It was beautiful, cold, and empty, much like its master. Julian had been given the East Wing, ostensibly for privacy, but the architecture of the house was designed to funnel sound and movement toward the central atrium. No matter where he went, he felt watched. The clause had stipulated cohabitation, but Cashin took it to mean surveillance. They ate dinner together, another requirement, at a table long enough to seat 20, seated at opposite ends like warring kings. "Your pheromones are sour," Cashin noted on the third night, swirling a glass of dark red wine. He didn't look up from his tablet. Distress? Or just general unpleasantness? Julian cut into his steak with more force than necessary. The screech of the knife against the china echoed loudly. "It's the stench of the company I keep. It's cloying." "Careful," Cashin warned, his eyes flashing. "You're an Omega in an Alpha's territory. Biologically, you should be trying to please me to ensure your safety. Biologically, you should have a heart, but we all know that organ was removed years ago to make room for your ego," Julian shot back. Cashin paused. A slow, dangerous smirk spread across his lips. He set the tablet down. "You still have that mouth. I remember when you used it for better things." The air in the room instantly grew heavy. The reference to their past was a slap in the face. Julian stood up, his appetite gone, replaced by a nausea born of rage and lingering, unwanted hurt. "I'm done," Julian said, throwing his napkin on the table. "Sit down," Cashin commanded. The voice, The alpha voice that bypassed the conscious brain and struck the primal centers of submission. Julian's legs buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He fought it, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind screaming no, while his body screamed obey. He forced himself to remain standing, trembling with the effort. "Do not," Julian hissed through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. "Use that tone on me." Cashin stared at him, genuine surprise flickering in his eyes. Few Omegas could resist a direct command from a Prime Alpha. The surprise faded, replaced by something darker. Appreciation. "Go," Cashin said, releasing the pressure. "Run away, Julian. It's what you do best." By the second month, the dynamic had shifted from Cold War to guerrilla skirmishes. Julian had taken to working in the Manor's library, spreading his blueprints across the massive oak tables. He needed to keep his firm running remotely. One rainy Tuesday, he was so engrossed in the structural load calculations for a new bridge that he didn't hear Cashin enter. "That support beam is insufficient." Julian jumped, knocking a stylus off the table. Cashin was standing right behind his chair, looking over his shoulder. He was too close. The heat radiating from him was palpable. "It meets the city code," Julian snapped, trying to lean away without looking like he was retreating. "The city code is for mediocrity. Draxo's steel doesn't deal in mediocrity," Cashin said. He reached over, his arm brushing against Julian's shoulder, to point at the blueprint. "If you account for wind shear at that altitude, you need a crossbrace here. Otherwise, the vibration will shatter the glass within 5 years." Julian looked at the spot. Cashin was right. "Damn him. I didn't ask for your opinion," Julian muttered, though he made a note on the digital file. "You're using the Vane inheritance to save your firm," Cashin stated, not as a question. "Why? It's a sinking ship. Just take the money and live a life of leisure. Paint. You used to paint. I build things now," Julian said firmly. "I create structures that last. Unlike us." Cashin went still. He pulled back, walking to the window to watch the rain lash against the glass. "You think I left you for the merger?" Cashin said softly. It was the first time they had spoken about it without layers of sarcasm. "I know you did. I saw the engagement announcement in the Times the day after you left my bed," Julian replied, the old wound throbbing. "I didn't marry her, because she died in a skiing accident a month before the wedding. That doesn't absolve you of the intent." Cashin turned around. His face was a mask of tormented restraint. "I didn't marry her because I called it off 3 days after I left you. The merger fell through. I lost $4 billion and nearly my position as CEO." Julian blinked, the information failing to compute. "What? What?" "Because," Cashin took a step forward, his voice dropping to a growl, "my father threatened to have you removed if I didn't comply. He was a man who solved problems with car bombs and overdoses, Julian. I left you to make you safe. I agreed to the engagement to buy time to dismantle his board of directors." You never told me," Julian whispered. "Would you have believed me?" Cashin laughed bitterly. "Or would you have tried to fight him? You're brave, Julian, but you were 21. He would have crushed you like an insect. I had to make you hate me so you would stay far, far away from the blast radius of my family." Julian felt the foundation of his anger cracking. 7 years of hatred, fueled by the belief that he wasn't enough, that he was discardable. "And now?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "Your father is dead, and I am the king," Cashin said, closing the distance between them. "No one touches what is mine." "I'm not yours," Julian said, though the protest lacked heat. "Aren't you?" Cashin challenged. "Why did your grandfather write this clause, Julian?" He was a senile old bat, but he saw things. "He knew I wouldn't contest the will. He knew I was the one who paid off your first business loan anonymously. He knew that if he forced us into a room for 6 months, the truth would eventually bleed out. It was a lot to process. The complex legal trap, the forced proximity, it wasn't torture. It was matchmaking from beyond the grave." "I still hate you," Julian lied. "Good," Cashin murmured, his hand coming up to cup Julian's jaw, his thumb brushing over the Omega's bottom lip. "Hate is passion. I can work with passion. Indifference is what kills me." The breaking point came in the 4th month. Julian had gone into the city to oversee a site visit. It was a routine inspection, but the weather had turned foul, a blizzard sweeping in from the coast. By the time he tried to drive back to the estate, the roads were icing over. His car spun out on the cliff road 2 miles from the manor. It wasn't a bad crash. He slid into a snowbank, but the engine died and the heating failed. The temperature was dropping rapidly. He had no signal. He sat there, shivering, watching his breath mist in the air, realizing with a detached calm that he might actually freeze to death this close to safety. Then, headlights cut through the whiteout. A massive black SUV tore up the road, drifting dangerously before slamming to a halt behind Julian's car. Cashin ripped the door open before the vehicle had fully stopped. He wasn't wearing a coat over his suit, and his eyes were wild, glowing with a luminescent violet hue, the sign of an alpha in pure, protective instinct mode. He tore Julian's door open. "Julian, I'm okay," Julian chattered, his teeth clicking. "Just stuck." Cashin didn't speak. He unbuckled Julian, hauled him out of the car, and crushed him against his chest. The heat coming off the alpha was like a furnace. Cashin buried his face in Julian's neck, inhaling deeply, checking for the scent of blood or pain. "I felt it," Cashin rasped against his ear. "The bond. It snapped. I knew you were in danger." "Bond?" Julian asked weakly as Cashin carried him to the SUV. "We don't have a bond. You never bit me." Cashin slammed the door shut, cranking the heat, and turned to look at him. "Do you really think a bite is what makes a mate, Julian? My soul has been tethered to yours since the moment you borrowed my pen in Intro to Architecture." They drove back to the manor in silence, but the air was charged with electricity. When they got inside, Cashin didn't stop at the entrance. He carried Julian straight up the grand staircase, past the east wing, to the master suite. He kicked the door open. "Cashin, put me down," Julian said, though he clung to the alpha's shoulders. "You're freezing," Cashin growled. "I need to warm you." He deposited Julian on the massive bed and began stripping off Julian's wet clothes with efficient, trembling hands. There was nothing sexual about it initially. It was purely medical, primal caretaking. But as skin met skin, the dynamic shifted. Julian lay there, shivering, looking up at the man who had been the villain of his story for so long. He saw the fear in Cashin's eyes, the terror of loss. "You really paid off my first loan?" Julian asked softly. Cashin paused, his hands resting on Julian's waist. "Yes." "And the clause? If you hated the idea, you could have found a loophole. You're the Emperor of Steel." "I didn't want a loophole," Cashin admitted, his voice raw. "I wanted you. I just didn't know how to ask without you spitting in my face. So I let the old man force your hand." Julian reached up, his fingers threading through Cashin's dark hair. The touch was a surrender. "You're an idiot, Cashin." "I know," Cashin whispered, leaning down. "But I'm your idiot." When Cashin kissed him, it wasn't the tentative kiss of their college days. It was acclaiming. It was 7 years of hunger, regret, and fury pouring into a single moment. Julian gasped, opening to him, the taste of cedar and ozone overwhelming his senses. "I need you," Cashin groaned against his lips. "I am starving for you." "Then eat," Julian breathed. The night was a blur of tangled limbs and desperate confessions. When the friction became too much, when the pleasure bordered on pain, Cashin's control finally snapped. He pinned Julian to the mattress, his canines lengthening. "Can I?" Cashin asked, hovering over the gland on Julian's neck. The spot that would bind them legally, biologically, and spiritually forever. "If I do this, there is no going back. You never leave this house. You never leave me." Julian looked up at him. He saw the darkness in Cashin, the possessiveness, but he also saw the devotion. He realized he didn't want to leave. The fortune, the manor, it didn't matter. "Do it," Julian commanded. "Mark me." Cashin sank his teeth in. The pleasure was blinding, a golden light exploding behind Julian's eyes as their souls finally knotted back together. 2 months later, the lawyer sat in the study, looking nervous. The 6-month period was over. "So," the lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Vane has successfully completed the residency requirement. The deed to the Vane estate and the trust funds are to be transferred to his name immediately." Julian sat in the leather chair, the one behind the desk this time. He was wearing one of Cashin's shirts, the sleeves rolled up. Cashin stood behind him, a hand resting possessively on Julian's shoulder. On Julian's neck, A faint, scarred bite mark was visible. That won't be necessary, Julian said, sliding the papers back across the desk. The lawyer blinked. I beg your pardon. Merge the assets, Julian said calmly. Put the Vane estate under the umbrella of Draxos Industries. But keep the architectural firm separate, under my name. But the inheritance, the lawyer stammered. You earned it. I have everything I need, Julian said, looking up at Cashin. The Alpha looked down at him with a look of such intense adoration, it was almost frightening. Besides, Cashin added, his voice that low, satisfied rumble. He doesn't need a house. He lives in mine. Our house, Julian corrected. Cashin smirked, leaning down to kiss the top of Julian's head. As you say, architect. As you say. And that is how the architect rebuilt the Emperor's heart, turning a prison into a home. If you enjoyed seeing Julian bring the billionaire to his knees, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, is it romantic or toxic that Cashin manipulated the legal system to trap his lover? Would you forgive him? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then, prompt image. Prompt. Masterpiece, best quality, high-res, 1.2. Korean manhwa style, semi-realistic, digital art. 2 men. BL, Yaoi, man 1. Cashin, tall, broad shoulders, dark hair, sharp jawline, wearing unbuttoned black dress shirt, intense possessive expression, glowing violet eyes, alpha vibes. Man 2. Julian, silver hair, slender but toned, wearing white oversized shirt, sitting on mahogany desk, head tilted back, exposing neck with a fresh bite mark, expression of surrender and ecstasy. Background is a dark Gothic study, rain on window, scattered blueprints on floor, dim warm lighting, cinematic composition, shallow depth of field, detailed textures.